Good morning, Tigers. So I'm going to just read the chapter for those of you that would prefer to listen and follow along. So starting here on page 83. Chapter 6, Everyday Life During War. Eliza Wilkinson heard horses galloping up the path to her door. Men bellowed horrible curses, and Eliza's heart chilled. Before she could flee, redcoats burst into her house, their swords and pistols drawn. "Where are these women rebels?" they shouted. They split open trunks and took Eliza's clothing, even the buckles on her shoes. They left with their shirts stuffed with stolen goods. The British against the war. The longer the war lasted, the less support people in Great Britain felt toward it. Ireland was part of the Britain Empire, and many Irish people sympathized with their colonists. They too felt they were treated unfairly by Parliament. Irish leaders organized their own boycotts and militia. To avoid another rebellion, Parliament acted quickly and gave Ireland more freedom to trade and more political freedom. This satisfied Ireland enough to remain in the empire for the time being. The war was costing the British government a fortune, and British citizens living in England, Scotland, and Wales had to pay the bill. They were taxed on everything: stamps, newspapers, and even the rabbit hair used on women's hat. British merchants also hated the war. They had grown rich on trade with America, and with the onset of war, that trade dried up. Plus, merchant ships were often captured by the American Navy and by privateers. As a result, prices of both livestock and land in England plummeted. The British military had to cope with the problem of getting enough men to enlist in the military. Parliament hired Hessians to staff the army, but they used press gangs to get more sailors. A press gang was a group of thugs who seized men off the street and forced them onto ships headed for America. As news of battlefield defeats hit the British newspapers, families worried about their sons dying in a land far away. Do you think lack of British support is one reason Britain lost the war? Women's roles. Regardless of whether they were loyalists or patriots, American women on the home front worked hard during the war. They had no choice. With the men off fighting, women were left to do all the chores, including the work that the men usually took care of. A typical colonial woman baked bread, preserved vegetables, cured meat, cooked and cleaned up meals, made candles, hand-washed laundry, spun threads, sewed clothes, cleaned house, cared for the children, served as the family teacher and doctor, and more. Now women also had to plant and harvest crops, cut and haul firewood, repair fences, forge tools, and butcher animals. The work never ended. Temperance Smith, a preacher's wife from Connecticut, could not even settle long enough to pray for her husband's safety. She worried whether she had remembered to set the sponge, yeast, for the bread, put water on the leach tub, turn the cloth in the dyeing vat, chopped enough wood for kindling, and on and on. She told the story of her own American Revolution experience to her 3 children, who later published the story in a magazine. How does a first-hand account of ordinary life help us better understand the war? Women were not allowed to vote in the 1700s, but they voiced their political opinions in other ways. When the boycott against British imports began, women across New England joined patriotic spinning bees. Instead of buying British cloth, they made their own. 11-year-old Anna Winslow from Boston called herself a daughter of liberty when she learned how to spin wool into yarn. Women signed petitions in which they pledged not to drink tea until the tea tax was repealed. Newspapers reported a group of women in New Hampshire who made their breakfast upon rye coffee. Women also began to think about the meaning of equality. In 1776, Abigail Adams wrote a letter to her husband, John Adams, who was at the Continental Congress helping Thomas Jefferson write the Declaration of Independence. Abigail wrote, "I desire you would remember the ladies. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. We will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." Poor women showed their political views in a more rowdy way. They rioted. Between 1776 and 1779, citizens rioted more than 30 times to confront merchants they thought were guilty of hiking up the price of scarce goods. In 1776, a New York merchant refused to sell the tea in his storehouse for a reasonable price. The town women stormed the warehouse, opened the tea chests, weighed and packaged the tea, and sold it to themselves. If you go back here to this section here, this American poet, Phillis Wheatley, was captured in Africa at the age of 7 and sold into slavery. Her owners in America taught Phillis how to read and write. Her first poem was published when she was only 13. Wheatley wrote more than 100 poems during her lifetime. Some of the poems reveal her love for America, while others condemn the practice of slavery. Here she expresses hope that the new Earl of Dartmouth will improve things for African Americans. No more, America, in mournful strain, of wrongs and grievance unredressed complain. No longer shalt thou dread the iron chain, which wanton tyranny with lawless hand had made, and with it meant to enslave the land. And then up here, Betsy Ross, history or myth? Most school children are taught that a seamstress named Betsy Ross made the first American flag. In 1870, Betsy Ross's grandson published a story that claimed his grandmother had designed the flag for General Washington when he stopped by her shop in 1776. But there is no evidence to prove this true. Ross was an upholsterer who stuffed mattresses, made curtains, and covered chairs. She did sew flags, but we may never know for certain if she designed the stars and stripes. Part of the reason women found cause to riot was inflation. Paying the bills was a challenge for the Continental Congress. The Congress created a national currency called Continentals. The money was issued in the amount of $1 or fractions of $1. However, when too many Continentals were printed, the prices of goods increased. This is what we call inflation. John Bocher was a school teacher in Virginia before the Revolutionary War. His yearly salary was $4,000 in today's money. A good horse saddle cost $180, and a wig, which most men wore, about $145. A pound of butter cost $1.50, and a prayer book $13.50. These prices show that the average colonist did not have much money for luxuries. It says, did you know? A new saying was born. If someone wanted to describe something as worthless, he would say, it ain't worth a continental. Many merchants used the barter method instead of accepting continentals for payment. After the war, the dollar was established as the United States official currency. Later, dimes and pennies were created. So the loyalist experience. So we have to remember there were people who were loyalists, loyal to the king. Historians estimate that 20% of colonists remained loyal to Great Britain during the war. Sometimes even family members chose different sides. Benjamin Franklin was an innovator and politician who served in the Constitutional Convention. He was a diplomat to France and one of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence. Meanwhile, his son William was a loyalist who was arrested for treason and imprisoned in a dungeon 70 feet below ground. His father did not lift a finger to help him. After 1781, the British Army began to withdraw from American cities. This was a terrifying time for loyalists. Their neighbors thought they were traitors and wanted revenge. Some people who were desperate to escape scurried on board British ships. Other families stood on the street, wringing their hands as they tried to decide if they should flee or stay. Loyalists who stayed were arrested and thrown into dungeons. Others were tarred and feathered or forced to wear the label Tory, which loyalists, they were thrown out of their homes. They were forced to sleep in the street. After the war ended, approximately 60,000 loyalists left the country. Hannah Ingram was only 11 when her family left New York for Nova Scotia. She said, "It was a sad, sick time after we landed. We had to live in tents. The melting snow and the rain would soak up in our beds as we lay. Mother got so chilled and was never well afterwards." Most loyalists settled in Canada. Some went to the British colonies in the Caribbean islands, while others moved to England. Many recorded their aching homesickness for the country they had left behind. James Clark, a loyalist who moved to Nova Scotia, wrote to a friend that his love of Rhode Island was so strong he would freely give up my life and 10,000 more if he could go back to how things used to be. So one of the questions, or today's questions that I'm asking is, How did the war impact civilian life, right? Civilian. A person not on active duty in the armed services or not on a police or firefighting force. So this were people who were not fighting the war. How did this affect them? There are a couple of activities. There's a Revolutionary War game that you can play. It goes through the directions here. And then on the next page, there is a recipe for cooking your own Indian pudding.